In this third and final part of our series on Conscious Manifestation 2020, Eckhart looks at what's possible once we come into presence, the fullness, the freedom, the natural abundance of life. Here's Eckhart Tolle.
The collective suffering that humans are experiencing at the present time is also an opportunity that's opening up for millions of humans, not that they're all going to recognize that and be able to use it, but some will, perhaps many, an opportunity for the beginning of an awakening, or perhaps even more than just the beginning of an awakening, the opportunity for an awakening of consciousness. Because if you don't, then you stay stuck in suffering. And you cannot create, manifest a better life for yourself or a better world from the place of suffering. You need to have gone beyond suffering in order to be able to manifest a better world. So the foundational step then is what I just described. And then you, as the transmutational process continues in you, then you are able occasionally to perhaps have certain thoughts that are no longer in conflict with the emotional reality in you, because there has been a transmutation of the fear, and when you can feel that intense presence, this is a good time, if you even want to do it, you can have a visualization or an affirmation of the goodness of life or the abundance of life, that life is abundant and it's no longer a lie. Because when you sense that presence in you, before it was fear perhaps, and then it's become presence, there is a feeling of intense aliveness. There is a heightened aliveness in that presence that would not have been there if life had not challenged you and first made you suffer and then caused you to become more conscious in order to transcend the suffering. That's how evolution happens. And so there is an aliveness in that conscious presence that is inseparable from what we may call abundance. That brings me to one of my favorite sayings of Jesus. He said, I want you to have the abundant life. That's in one translation. In another translation, it says, I want you to have the fullness of life. So some Bibles translate it as abundant life. Some Bibles translate it as the fullness of life. I want you to have the fullness of life. He's talking, yes, abundant life. What does that mean? Abundance in conventional terms, when you think of abundance, we think of many things. You can have lots of things and you have abundance. But true abundance is something, it's not lots of things, although maybe lots of things may come to you, but you don't need lots of things in order to experience abundance. You experience abundance through experiencing the presence within you is the abundance. It is the fullness of life, the fullness of life that is within you now. Oh. And then we come to another saying of Jesus. So we're talking about Jesus. Let's use another very important, the most important thing anybody has ever said about manifesting things is in one sentence that Jesus said, that you don't need all the books written about manifesting. Once you understand that one sentence, you don't need to read any of them. And that sentence is, when you pray for something, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. Believe that, now the key, of course, is not believe that you will receive it. The key is believe that you have received it. And then it will be yours. The will be refers to the thing, whatever it is that you pray for. But what does that mean? How can you believe that you have received it when obviously you haven't received it? Now, this can only be understood together with his statement about the fullness of life. It is when you realize the fullness of life, that is the power of your own consciousness. It's not your own, but let's just call it your own. It's universal consciousness. And this awareness, this presence is universal consciousness. Let's temporarily call it your consciousness. It's not yours, because if you say your consciousness, you have a separation between you and consciousness. But there is no duality here. There's only the consciousness that you are. So when you realize that the power of your consciousness, the power of consciousness is the fullness of life. And you can then, nothing that you could add to yourself could be any greater than that. So when you realize the fullness of life, which you can only realize in the present moment, when the emotion of fear or other negative emotion has become transmuted into intense presence, then this intense presence is the fullness of life. Anything else that you could obtain in life and that you as a person may want or may enjoy or may need on a personal level is the icing on the cake. Now, to this important realization that all manifestation, you can only be a really successful manifestation practitioner if you realize that whatever you manifest is the icing on the cake, because you already have the cake. You are the cake. If you don't realize that, then life is frustrating, because even whatever you do manifest, if you think that's the cake, it's not going to satisfy you for long. It might even make you sick. If you eat too much cake, it may make you sick. So the cake is the essence of who you are, is the presence. If you bring an image of what you want to obtain or achieve into that feeling of presence or aliveness, then that can become a very powerful manifestation. You want to have a better place to live, perhaps, whatever it is. But you don't need it to experience the fullness of life. You can only be successful at manifesting if you don't need whatever it is that you want to manifest in order to give you the experience of the fullness of life, which we could use other words to describe it, the experience of being fully yourself, the experience of having made it, the experience of a fuller sense of identity, whatever it may be, because people don't want the thing that they think they want. They want the feeling that that thing will give them. You don't want the car just for the sake of the car. You want the feeling that is associated with the car and the mental image that's associated with I am the owner of this car. It's my car. That's what they want. The car itself would be meaningless. So they want, whatever they want is always a secondary thing. They want this fullness of life through something else. So I'm really describing how manifestation does not work. And even if it did work in that way, and sometimes it does in a limited way, it's not the answer, and it doesn't make you happy, and it won't ultimately solve anything. So the powerful manifester, if that's a word, is the one who is already in touch with the fullness of life and manifests from the fullness of life. And again, Jesus said, so many beautiful things there. Find only the kingdom of heaven that is within you, which is again the fullness of life, which is the presence, the unconditioned consciousness, and all the things that you need or think you need will be added onto you. That's an amazing thing. It's even when you do not specifically attempt or practice manifesting specific things in your life, which some people do and some don't. It's an interesting practice. But even if you did not want to manifest specific things, your life will change as a result of being in touch with that dimension within you, the fullness of life. Because from there, manifestation happens. It even happens when you're no longer even want to manifest because you're fine, but you represent then a different level of consciousness in this world, and the way in which you experience this world changes, and the way in which you affect the world changes. So you cannot help but manifest when you undergo this shift in consciousness. And even if you don't undergo it fully, you still begin to manifest a different world. First of all, a different world for yourself, because the way in which you experience the world depends on your state of consciousness. One person may react to the same circumstances very differently from another person, depending on their level of consciousness. So one person encounter a particular form of adversity, a very unconscious person, and reacts in their way. And so they experience a very different world from a person who meets the same adversity from an awakened state of consciousness, experience it a different world. And not only that, the way in which let's say, whatever event you're experiencing in the present moment, the way in which you meet this event, the state of consciousness from which you meet this event determines the subsequent development of that event. This is a somewhat esoteric thing, but the so-called world and your state of consciousness are a single phenomenon. There is not really a world if nobody experiences it. So the consciousness that you are and the world are a single thing. When your consciousness changes, the world changes. First of all, the way in which you experience the world changes, which basically means the world changes for you. And if the world changes for a sufficient number of people, then even the so-called outside world changes. So for the world to change, there needs to be a shift in consciousness. But you begin to experience this in your own life first, and then you begin to inhabit a different world. So you manifest, of course, always. Most people manifest, as I'm sure you know, most people manifest unconsciously because their conditioning of the way in which their mind is conditioned determines how they experience events in their life, and that becomes their world. So they manifest every moment. So how do you manifest your experience of this moment? That's another way of looking at manifestation. How do you manifest this moment? It depends on your level or state of consciousness. And so there's your freedom. You are not dependent ultimately on external conditions. And that's when you realize that you are not at the mercy of what's happening or not happening around you. So you develop, this is a wonderful realization, a wonderful freedom, that your consciousness is not dependent on this or that happening or not happening. That's an incredible realization, and it's a sense of liberation.
But the amazing thing is for you to discover that you don't need to think all the time, that there is a realm, a dimension of consciousness in you that does not consist of thought. That's an amazing discovery. And as perhaps, I would say, the most essential discovery for anybody to make, and I believe it's never been mentioned on the news. The world's most amazing discovery, never been mentioned. So you have two identities, we could say. You have your form-based identity, which is the identity of your physical body, and your psychological identity that is largely determined by your past. The past, so-called past, leaves accumulations in the mind, and of course that's what the past is, because apart from the accumulations in your mind there is no past. There's only the eternal present. So apart from the identity that is past-based of who you are, which is a mixed bag for most people. There's good stuff in it and bad stuff in it. For some people, it's pretty bad. That's the sense. So that's where people get their sense of self from, who I am. And that's what they like to think about. Most people's mind activity is, to a large extent, occupied by thinking about themselves and trying to solve the problem of me, trying to solve me and my problems. The strange thing is, you solve one and another one pops up behind you, problem after another. And so you have to think even harder about yourself, especially in the middle of the night. And so your sense of identity becomes a problematic one, very common phenomenon for most people. To the extent even that they regard themselves as a problem to be solved. I am a problem that requires a solution. And that's a heavy identity. And this is what happens easily when you're not aware of your deeper, more essential identity that has nothing to do with your personal history or your past or your future, but realizing the essence of who you are is formless, a formless sense of presence, like this. Sometimes I call it space consciousness. Sounds a little bit like science fiction, but it's not. It's awareness of that inner space, or spaciousness. And usually meditation is designed to help you realize that. No matter what technique you use, the technique is not the meditation. The meditation is the realization of your essence. Now, many people who meditate don't really get anywhere much with their meditation. First of all, because they think they need to get somewhere. That's why they don't get anywhere. And they think meditation is a doing rather than realizing it's the relinquishment of doing, even internally. But this does not mean sleep. In ordinary life, the relinquishment of doing is usually associated with the onset of sleep. Everybody stops doing when they finally drop off to sleep. Well, they're still dreaming, so they're still doing, but then they go periodically into dreamless sleep, and that's the end of all doing. But here, that you consciously realize the being state as your essential self. And another reason why for many people meditation works a little bit, but a big barrier is also the belief that there is something to achieve when you meditate. But true meditation is not an achievement, but a discovery. Now, what's the difference between an achievement and a discovery? An achievement is something that you do and you make it happen and you create it. Discovery means there's something that's already there. You don't create it, you don't contribute to that. You discover a new continent, you discover a new planet. You don't achieve a new planet. It's already there, but you didn't know it was there. So this dimension of consciousness is already there in everyone. The only thing is, they are so hypnotized by the paintings on the canvas, which are your sense perceptions, your thoughts, your emotions, that they are never aware of the canvas itself as the essence of the painting. That's all. So it's just, one could say, a redirecting of your attention. Normally, your attention is in sense perceptions and thoughts. In the Bhagavad Gita scripture, it has this image of wild horses that are dragging along the carriage, which are the sense perceptions that pull your attention continuously outward, like wild horses, and you can't stop them. Now, that was a long, long time ago. Now, that hasn't changed, but something has changed in the meantime since that was written. The mind, the thinking function, has become magnified and amplified since then. So the real wild horse is much wilder than the senses which draw your attention. Something that draws your attention much more powerfully is your thoughts. Because humans, contemporary humans, are burdened with incessant bombardment of thinking. Dreadful state. Before I forget, I would like to acknowledge all those people who are with us, not physically, but in other parts of the world. And apparently, if I look straight ahead, into the camera, then I can connect with them visually. It's nice to have you with us, wherever you are, whatever time it is where you are. Of course, it's the present moment. There may be more people there than here, but it doesn't really matter. I have a feeling that we may have questions and answers in this session. It's no more than a feeling, so we'll see. Remember, being here in this environment especially, sensory perception not just visual and auditory. Have you noticed that there's a fragrance scent in the air? A very wonderful freshness and scent. Be aware of that. There's a breeze coming from the sea. You can feel it on your skin. So you have all the senses simultaneously. That should bring you into the present moment. Can't do a lot of thinking when you're aware simultaneously of visual, auditory, tactile, and I suppose olfactory senses. Very helpful. And have you noticed that there are quite a few ancient olive trees around here, which these must have been here. Of course, before this was built, there must have been olive groves or olive tree plantations here. And you can see that some of them are of an enormous age. What perhaps you may not know, I know it because I googled it. It is olive trees can reach an age of 2,000 to 3,000 years. So it's not impossible that you look at a tree here, it may be 2,500 years old and was a young tree when Socrates walked past it or sat or looked at it or said, "What a lovely young tree that is." Or some other ancient Greek philosopher might have already been sitting, leaning against this young olive tree and giving philosophical discourse. They have almost a presence. They have a presence, almost like an old, even almost a personality in addition to an invisible presence. One last bit of information. There's a tree apparently on the Isle of Crete, not that far from here, that is supposed to be the oldest, or one of the very few oldest, that is probably 3,000 years old, olive tree. That was 500 years before the Buddha. But that tree continuously lives in the timeless dimension of now. Deeply rooted not only in the earth, but also deeply rooted in being. If I start speaking now, there may be no end to it. So I won't say too much in order to allow time for questions, in case any questions have still survived in you after being present here. Some questions, you may notice, dissolve at some point, because they're not important, because the mind had a curiosity. I wonder, Eckhart, how many incarnations have you had? What did you have for breakfast? Questions like that tend to dissolve in the presence. And other questions, an answer may suddenly arise from within you because you became still. There's a story of, I believe it was a British writer, Paul Brunton, I think it was, who in the 30s visited the guru, spiritual teacher Ramana Maharshi at his ashram in India in order to, he was preparing a book on the spiritual teachers of India. The book was later published under the title In Search of Secret India. And he visited Ramana Maharshi. The guru at that time was not too well known outside his immediate circle. And he had a list of questions, very important questions for his book. So he came into Ramana's room, and Ramana looked at him in a state of thoughtless awareness, and Paul Brunton looked at him, and he didn't ask a single question. All the questions dissolved in the presence. On that particular occasion, that was the first time he met him. He may later have asked him questions. Another little anecdote connected with Ramana Maharshi. A famous British writer visited the ashram. Somerset Maugham is his name. And again, he was preparing a book, a novel that involved an Indian spiritual teacher. And just before he was to meet Ramana Maharshi, Somerset Maugham fainted, probably because it was so hot. So they carried him into a room, and he was lying there on a bed. And when he came to, Ramana Maharshi was sitting there next to his bed looking at him. And he was confused and didn't know what to say, and Ramana Maharshi said something like, "Silence is the best speech." And that was the end of that encounter. And later on, in a novel called The Razor's Edge, Ramana Maharshi appears as one of the characters. But that is the look that also you can practice. It is the look that where you're not a person, you're just a presence. I've been looking at this folder. It has questions in it. People submit lots of questions. So I will answer perhaps a few. And from tomorrow, we are open, or I am open to receiving questions from you that arise spontaneously, or that you've kept at the back of your mind for a long time, wanting to ask, and it still hasn't dissolved. It's beautiful, by the way, if a question dissolves that you've had, which means, well, you could still ask it, but it's no longer of vital importance. sometime in the 1930s, a British writer went to India. I believe his name was Paul Brunton. He went to India to visit the living masters and interview them and then write a book about them. And he did. And one of the masters he visited was Ramana Maharshi, at the time not known in the West at all, and only to a limited extent in India. And so when he went in to see Ramana Maharshi with his a long list of questions for his book, and Ramana Maharshi just looked at him. There are some photos around with Ramana Maharshi looking at you, especially one that's very beautiful. And so he just looks. You can feel when he looks, even on that photo, he's not thinking whatsoever. There's no thought whatsoever in his mind. There's just spaciousness. But it's not a look of a zombie. It's presence, spacious presence. Well, you can have that now. There's nobody there looking. There's just consciousness. Nobody in particular, just consciousness. So it's not a person looking, and that's the energy transmission also happens in that way. It cannot happen when a person is looking at you, because that means the looking happens through the veil of conditioning. That is the person, mental, emotional conditioning. But here the looking comes straight from the depths of consciousness, unconditioned consciousness. So it's just the light looking. So Paul Brunton came to see into Ramana Maharshi's room, and Ramana Maharshi just looked at him. And suddenly Paul Brunton had no longer any desire to ask his questions. And they sat in silence together for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, I don't remember. And then Paul Brunton thanked him and left the room. That was the interview. This happened again a few years later. The famous British author Somerset Maugham visited India, and he had probably read Paul Brunton's book that in the meantime had been published, where he wrote very favorably about Ramana Maharshi, who was the one teacher that impressed him most. So Somerset Maugham came to experience the presence of this master, probably to write about him, because whatever Somerset Maugham did and whoever he met, he would write about them later. He continuously was making notes about people. And just before Ramana Maharshi came into his room, it was so hot there, he fainted. And not Ramana Maharshi, Somerset Maugham fainted. They carried him into a room to put him on a bed there to regain consciousness. And then they told Ramana Maharshi, there's a famous British author who came to see you, but he fainted. And Ramana Maharshi said, okay, I'll go to where he is. And when Somerset Maugham opened his eyes, there was Ramana Maharshi sitting, looking at him. And again, no words were spoken, except, if I remember correctly, they looked at each other, and then Ramana Maharshi said something like, silence is the best speech. And that was about it. That was the meeting of the famous British author with the spiritual master. And of course, yes, he did write a book, and Ramana Maharshi appears as a character in that book. And although he doesn't, of course, under a different name as a master. And if you're interested, the book is called The Razor's Edge, a novel. But that is the look that also you can practice. It is the look that where you're not a person, you're just a presence. And when you look at a tree or the sky or a flower or another person, if that's not too difficult, if you look at them and there's no mind activity, just an underlying presence as the backdrop, so to speak, to your sense perception, then at that moment, you're not a person looking at the world, you are consciousness looking ultimately at itself, its own creations, because everything is consciousness that has taken a particular form, a temporary form. There's only the one underlying all forms. And in that looking, there's not only the absence of the person, there is also the presence of presence. And that means whatever you are looking at, you sense something that is deeper than the surface appearance of that thing that you are looking at. In the case of a plant or a flower, yes, there is the surface beauty of the flower or the plant, but there is also something that the eye cannot see. There is a beautiful quote that is, I believe, from a book called, is it The Little Prince? Saint-Exupéry, is that the author? And there's a quote that says, what is essential is invisible to the eye. What is essential is invisible to the eye. This eye. It does not only refer to the visual sense, it also refers to all the other senses. So what is essential, the essence of things, of human beings, of yourself, of a tree, of a dog, the essence of the thing is you cannot see or perceive with the senses. So if you only perceive through the conditioned mind as the person, then all you ever see or perceive with the other senses is the surface, never the essence of that life form. So what is essential is invisible to the eye. How can you become aware of that which is beyond the sense perception, that the deeper dimension of things, which for many humans alive now does not exist, and the majority of scientists would probably, there are maybe some exceptions, but Einstein was an exception, but the majority of scientists would probably deny that there is such a thing as a deeper dimension to things. But eventually they will come around. If not this generation, when this generation is dead, the next one will come around. So then you look at something, at a tree, a flower, and that presence of presence through which you're looking recognizes something of itself in that which you're looking at, and that is the dimension of depth. And that is where you feel connected, or a better word, where you feel that sense of oneness with that which you are looking at. No longer the separation. When you're looking through the conditioned mind as a person, there's always a sense of separateness. Whatever you're looking at is the other. And there's always a sense of otherness. And that sense of otherness is the absence of love in the deepest sense. You cannot love the other in that state of consciousness. You can try, or you might convince yourself for a while that it's working, but it won't last. So, to sense something deeper that is within, that is the essence of that life form, that adds a depth to all your perceptions. It's no longer a surface reality. Everything has a depth to it, and that depth, in traditional spirituality, is called sacredness. As you know, I may have mentioned before, nature can always help you to get back into presence and out of your mind. Out of your mind has negative connotations, but not in the way I use it. So even in the midst of a city, there's always a little bit of nature somewhere. In New York, you might have to look like a tourist, but the tourists are looking at the buildings and you'll be looking at the little bit of sky. So the sky is always there. So even to look at the sky can be a meditation. You can look at the sky, and whether it's cloudy, if it's cloudy, there will still be light coming through the clouds, otherwise it would be completely dark. So there is this, the analogy is the sky is your consciousness, the emptiness of the sky, the vastness of the sky is the unconditioned consciousness, and the clouds are the thought formations, or mental emotional formations. And sometimes the sky is totally cloudy, dense layers of cloud. Even then there is some light coming through. And there's it's a good analogy, but the best thing probably that you can find in this world of sense-perceived phenomena, the best comparison or analogy to the inner spaciousness, stillness, unconditioned consciousness is actually the clear sky. Now the interesting thing about the clear sky, that we have a name for it. You say the sky. In some languages you have two names, one is heaven and one is sky. In other languages there's only sky, which both can mean heaven or sky. So in those translations Jesus says the kingdom of the sky. In French, Italian, probably Italian, Spanish, German, Jesus actually says, when he talks about kingdom of heaven, it's actually translated as the kingdom of the sky. And so that's very interesting, because the sky is actually nothing. If you ever went up in this direction hoping to get there, you would never find it. Because ultimately the sky does not actually exist as something in this sense, but in the same way that a table exists or a cloud exists, although it appears as if it were one of many things in this world. We have a noun for it, the sky, But if you look, there is no such thing as the sky. It's a certain appearance. There is the sunlight. Beyond it, there is the vastness and darkness of outer space. And somehow the two coming together creates the illusion that there's something there. But you could never touch it or feel I'm now in it. You can be in a cloud, but you can't be in the sky. You never know, where is it? I've been going upwards for 20 miles and still don't know where it is, and before you know it, you're in outer space. Where was it? There is no sky. In the same way that the consciousness that underlies everything, that is the essence of who you are, does not actually exist in this world in the same way in which an object exists in this world. Although we have a word for it, we have a noun for it, we call it the consciousness, believing that there is something that is consciousness, but there isn't. It is an emanation from the unmanifested, so in itself, the consciousness is not an object. You could never say, there it is. That's actually, Jesus said literally, when they asked, when does the kingdom of heaven come, or where is it? Kingdom of the sky. You can never say, there it is, or it's over there. That's what he literally said. So you can't say the consciousness, this is the analogy, the sky is the consciousness. Not the only place where it's also used sometimes in Chinese, ancient Chinese spirituality, philosophy, Taoism, and so on. The heaven, the sky, the vastness of it, but it is intangible. It does not exist in the same way that consciousness does not exist, because exist, that word means ex is from the Latin out. Ist comes to stand. It stands out. Something that exists stands out into this world. It projects itself into this dimension. But the sky does not exist because you can never find it. And the consciousness does not exist in the way that something out here exists. It is the ground for existence. It is the being before the being becomes something. So there is being and there is existence. The being, very different. It sounds almost like an obscure existentialist treatise, being and existence. But that is why people like Jesus use the sky as the closest he could get to explaining what the unconditioned consciousness is. And so when you look at the sky, the equivalent of the vast emptiness or spaciousness of the clear sky is your inner spaciousness or emptiness. And you can never say, it can never become an object for yourself in the same way as I see the table, or there I'm now aware of the consciousness. You can't be aware of the consciousness because the awareness is it. So there's no duality. You can't make it into an object. And that means when you are rooted in that dimension within yourself, that is very different from the form identity, the egoic identity. In the egoic identity, you have made yourself into an object of consciousness, starting with, as we mentioned the other day, the pool of water in which Narcissus saw himself, the ancient myth. And so that was the beginning of human consciousness forming an image of itself and mistaking the mental image for who you are. So you make yourself into an object of consciousness. Then you have a relationship with this object of consciousness, which is a mental creation, a mental formation. And this object of consciousness becomes you, and you have a relationship with yourself. That's a strange thing. Now you will find that your dog is so much happier than you and experiences so much more joy because the dog does not have a relationship with him or herself, hasn't created a mental image that he can be unhappy with. I'm not happy with the way I look. My tail is too short. My legs are too short. So it has therefore its life, nothing in nature has a relationship with itself. It is itself. The tree is itself, the flower is itself. It is never unhappy about itself. You can only be unhappy about yourself if you have a relationship with yourself, which is the ego. So if you discover within yourself that a lot of the time you're in a state of lack, of insufficiency, of not enough, and you feel that the answer to, the remedy is to be active in this world and achieve and do as much as possible, then you'll probably find that ultimately that is not the answer to your state of lack. In order to transcend, to go beyond your state of lack, of neediness, of not enough, spiritual practice and spiritual realization is necessary. Focus on the realization of being. It's only there that you can go beyond that state of lack, which is ego. Go within and discover who or what you are beyond the person.
So ways of knowing, the conceptual way of knowing is pretty useless for knowing who or what you are in the depths of your being, or to get even an inkling of what might be the deeper meaning behind the word God, to get a sense of what that might refer to. So your conceptual mind cannot really help you, although sometimes certain words that one uses can be helpful as pointers, but not as explanations. A word can point you in the right direction of non-conceptual knowing. So you can use a concept as a pointer towards non-conceptual knowing. For example, when I say stillness, the possibility of letting go of the stream of thinking and becoming still. And when you become still, thinking has subsided, but you haven't fallen asleep unless you're badly jet-lagged. Thinking has subsided, but you remain awake. And that state of wakefulness is awareness. When thinking subsides, awareness or presence, same thing, presence remains. That's very interesting, and that's an incredibly important skill. Until it becomes second nature, you could call it a skill, to learn to step out of the stream of thinking, perhaps initially by being aware of your breathing. That stills the mind, and then there's a stillness that remains. That stillness is aware presence. And there you enter the field of true gnosis, Gnosis, the deeper knowing of your essential reality. And that is a non-conceptual knowing. That's the only knowing that you can use, can be helpful in trying to not understand God, because that's not possible, but to get a sense, a kind of realization of what that word actually means, the reality to which it points. But it's not only, as a little aside for a moment, it's not only knowing yourself, where the non-conceptual knowing is important. The non-conceptual knowing, to become familiar with that kind of knowing, is important even in this world. Knowing things in this world, again, you can know things through mental concepts, the screen of mental concepts, or you can know things more directly without conceptualization, a totally different way of knowing. And I emphasize that both are necessary for a human being, but in our civilization, most humans are completely lost in the conceptual reality. They can no longer, or very rarely, and many humans not at all, relate to this world without the screen of conceptualization, which is through thinking, immediately labeling everything that they experience, every sense perception, having a mental commentary about every sense perception. Oh, look at that tree, isn't that lovely? I wonder what it's called. Isn't that a tree that I saw last year in such and such a place? I wonder. And now you don't even have to rely on your thinking. You get your phone out and say, let's see what this tree is. There's an app for it. There's an app that you take a photo and it tells you what the name of the tree. So you can go, oh, and that's I have that app, by the way, because sometimes it's quite nice to have. But if you're trapped in that, if you cannot relate to the tree in any deeper way than through concepts, that's very limiting. Ideally, you have both in your life, but I don't emphasize concepts because you have that already. Everybody has far more concepts than they need. Everybody is trapped in a conceptual reality. Humans yourself have made themselves into a conceptual entity, which is the ego, the narrative of me, which you call my life. So that learning this way of knowing that is non-conceptual, not learning it, rediscovering it, because before humans were excessively burdened by the conceptual mind thousands of years ago, they had a bit more access to this non-conceptual knowing. So when you look at a tree, trees are a wonderful example because they're such wonderful beings. And even on this huge property here, I've seen some amazing, in this case, yes, they have a name, olive trees. But so knowing that it is an olive tree does not necessarily mean that you're trapped in a concept. You know there's an olive tree, but you're not trapped in the concept. You're still able to then let go of the concept and then look at the tree. And be still while you look. Maybe you even touch it, but it's not necessary. You could. As long as there's nobody around, people might think you're weird. So you look at the tree and you're still at the same time. And then you can know the tree, not through concepts, but you can sense the life of the tree. Now we are using into the realm of what is perhaps conventionally called mysticism, but that's just a word, but really means refers to a deeper knowing. But our civilization dislikes that because our civilization is dominated by conceptualization and the ego. There are egoic entities everywhere, not just individual egos, but egoic entities, like even at CNN is an egoic entity. Fox is an egoic entity. To talk about American TV station, in case you don't know. The political party is an egoic entity. A corporation is an egoic collective entity. They're everywhere. So you can sense the being of the tree. That sounds very weird. I'm sorry about that. You sense the aliveness, the being, the presence of the tree, and you know it in a much deeper way. And you know something, the tree that is deeper than what your senses tell you about the tree. Now, the ancient humans in almost probably all cultures and civilizations had more access to that dimension because the conceptual mind was not quite as developed, not as advanced, developed yet. So there was still some room for sensing, to knowing things at a deeper level. Let's go back to the tree. When you look at this tree and you're still, but so there is an intelligence there, but it's not what we conventionally call intelligence. There's a different kind of intelligence. And this is the beginning of wisdom, where intelligence turns into wisdom. Wisdom is associated with this deeper way of knowing that they go together, almost they're one almost. So you sense the aliveness of the tree, its beingness, and then you come to that, what ancient cultures knew, and we have to use that word, and that's the fringe of God, so to speak. You sense the sacredness of the tree. You sense the sacredness of this life form. And you then, what arises then is a certain respect for the life form of the tree. In many ancient cultures, trees were considered sacred. And sometimes they chose particular trees that were particularly sacred. And often ceremonies, religious, spiritual ceremonies were performed where there were groves of trees, and people get drawn there because they could sense the energy field that emanates from those trees. Now, the modern human cannot sense that because the modern human only knows the tree through conceptualization. So we need both. It's good to know, sometimes it's helpful to know the name of the tree. It also can be helpful to know things about the tree, how it grows, how old it is. You can countless PhDs have been written about trees, I'm sure of that. And you can write new ones too. So there's a lot you can conceptually know and say, we don't know yet about the tree. You can ask all kinds of questions. How does the water get up into the high branches how does the tree pull up the water? I'm sure PhDs have been written about that and there's some answer. But that's all conceptual. So inviting the non-conceptual knowing into your life is very important. Reality itself, as you perceive it, goes through the filter of your mental emotional conditioning from the past. Now, the non-conceptual dimension of consciousness, as we could call it, is already emerging in most of you. And that is about the most important thing that could happen in a person's life, which is the emergence of a deeper dimension of consciousness. I would say that this is what Jesus referred to when he was talking to Mary in the parable of Mary and Martha. And just to quote one brief sentence of just a few words, he said to Martha, "Only one thing is needed. Only one thing is needed." My translation of that is, there's only one thing in life that is of absolute importance. And everything else may also be important, but it is of relative importance. So all the things that happen in your life and in the world may all be important, some more important than others. Your entire life situation, everybody has one, and everybody's life situation is somewhat, if not very, problematic. You're not the only one. So there's that. There is all the things that happen, your financial situation, your health situation, your relationship situation, your work situation, your living situation. Yes, these things matter, relatively speaking, but there's one thing that is more important, that matters absolutely, and that is your state of consciousness. And whether or not you have awakened to what we could call, it sounds a little abstract, but it's not, we could call the transcendent dimension of consciousness in you. The transcendent dimension of consciousness. Now, I'm not going to immediately define what that means, because actually it cannot be defined. It can be pointed to, this is what these words are for, but these words are not a substitute for it. The words point. Famous phrase in Buddhism, it's the finger pointing to the moon. But the finger is not the moon. So there's nothing that I say tonight that you need to believe on a conceptual level. I'm not asking you to believe anything whatsoever. There is what I sometimes call the two levels of consciousness, the conceptual. I sometimes call that object consciousness. These are all the things that happen in your perceptual field and in your mental field, thinking, emotions, sense perceptions. Things arise, things pass away, things come and go, sense perceptions, ideas, thoughts, opinions, feelings, emotions, all belong to object consciousness. One object after another happens. You perceive things, there, and then thought objects arise continuously, a stream of thoughts. No, for most people, the stream of thoughts has such a gravitational pull that they get completely dragged along by this continuously proliferating stream of mental activity. I sometimes call it the voice in the head. It never stops speaking. It continuously comments on where you are, what you're doing, or takes you somewhere completely different in the so-called past or the so-called future. One thing after another, one damn thing after another, to paraphrase Churchill. Churchill was talking about history. History is just one damn thing after another, and that's true. But for many people, their conditioned mind, the experience of their conditioned mind is just one damn thing after another, because it never leaves you alone. It goes. So most humans who are not awakened or even awakening are completely trapped in their object consciousness. They are confined by it, and not only that, they are completely identified with all the arising thoughts and emotions that continuously go through their mind. And there's no separation between the thoughts and the emotions that accompany the thoughts, and you're not even there. When you're totally identified with the voice in the head, you are, spiritually speaking, asleep. Or another word for it is unconscious. So an unconscious person, in ordinary usage, unconscious means, of course, you've completely lost, you don't know what's going on, and this is unconscious. In conventional usage, unconscious means, in spiritual usage, unconscious means completely and continuously identified with the stream of thinking and the emotions that go with the stream of thinking. What does it mean to be identified? It means you derive your sense of who you are from the stream of thinking. Every thought is imbued with a sense of self. So you're identified. It has you in its grasp. And therefore, if you say, people conventionally say, I think, what do you think? As if thinking for most people were a voluntary activity, whereas for most, not you, but those who are not awakening yet, which is the majority of the population still on the planet, for most, that is, they are completely identified with the stream of thinking. They are, spiritually speaking, unconscious. And that is a terrible thing, because then everything that you perceive, reality itself as you perceive it, goes through the filter of your mental emotional conditioning from the past. So you never see anything as it is, perceive anything clearly, and most importantly, there is never a sense of true inner peace, spaciousness, joy, sense of aliveness, sense of connectedness with something that is deeper than your historical person. You're always at the mercy of what goes on out there and the reactive patterns of your mind. So you're completely unaware of the possibility of realizing the other dimension of consciousness, which is not object consciousness, but space consciousness. I call it sometimes space consciousness. Now, what is space consciousness? You cannot define it because it's beyond concepts. You can know what space consciousness is in this very moment by becoming aware of the
gaps between words when I speak. I'm just slowing down a little bit. So instead of being totally interested in the words, you're also interested, although that's probably not the right word, you're also giving attention to the empty spaces between the words, because they are needed. Without the spaces, there could be no sounds. The sound needs the space to exist. Oh, that's interesting. To be aware of the gaps between words. Or, in this room, in this hall, to be aware not only of the objects in this room, the objects that make up this room, what's in it, the bodies, the objects, that which confines and defines the room, the ceiling, the walls, the floor, this is the room. You're not only aware of that would be, in this analogy, object consciousness, you're also aware of the space in this room. Now, the space isn't something that you say, oh, it's there, or it's there. But it is the most important part of this room is the space. And it's a wonderful space, but you cannot define it. It has no actual, you can't even say that space exists, because exist means to manifest, to stand out. Exist, ex means out from Latin. Exist means to be manifested. But space doesn't manifest, it enables everything to manifest in the physical realm. Without space, these things could not be here. So space is prior to existence. Space is prior to manifestation. And that's very interesting. So there is something in you, which I sometimes call space consciousness, that is prior to who you are as a person, your personality. And you can know it, not conceptually, but immediately and experientially, by becoming aware either of the spaciousness outside of you, or becoming aware of spaces between sounds, spaces between words. Now, how do you do that? How do you become aware of a space between two words? There is no how, because it's too simple for how. Quite simply, there's an attention in you, a field of alert attention, and this field of alert attention is aware of the space between words. You notice that silent space. What does it mean to notice that silent space? It means in this brief moment of noticing, or noticing the space in this room, in this brief moment, you're not thinking, you're just aware. Through thinking, you cannot be aware of those spaces between words, because thinking is object consciousness. The space between words takes you to space consciousness. So the entire secret of our gathering here, of all spirituality, is just one thing. Now, amazingly, I'm going to talk about this one thing for hours.
To become spiritually conscious is the arising of what we could call a dimension of consciousness that is very different from the conventional consciousness, which is when people say, of course, everybody is awake, yes, but not spiritually awake. Everybody who is awake without being spiritually awake is actually unconscious, spiritually speaking. So to be unconscious is to be unaware of your inner state and so identified with your inner state that there's nothing else. There is just you are in the grip of either an emotion or a train of thoughts, and usually they go together. Emotion reflects thought, thought creates emotion, emotion amplifies and energizes thought. There's a vicious circle when you're trapped in that kind of negativity. And you are, spiritually speaking, unconscious if you are being possessed by these inner states, mental, emotional. On the emotional level, it's the feeling, fear, anxiety, or anger. It's the feeling, you feel it in your body. And then it rises into your mind, and then it creates narratives that reflect that emotion. And often the narratives create the emotion. So you become aware not only of what's happening in your emotional field, but you also become aware, and this enormous step forward in the evolution of your consciousness, you become aware of the kinds of thought that your mind is producing. Now, that is the beginning of what we call awakening or spiritual awakening. Now, before that happens, you are the thoughts that come into your head. You are so identified, there's no space. So every thought that comes into your head takes possession of your mind, and you go, and often accompanied by an emotion, and you go, and you don't realize that something lives in you that isn't really you, but it feeds on you, it speaks through you, it thinks. I'm acting it out because it sometimes works better than explanations. And you can recognize it. You can recognize that state. If it's fear, it's like, oh my God. And then fearful thoughts go through your mind. That we call unconsciousness. Now, in conventional terms, you are conscious, but you are spiritually unconscious because you are totally identified with the movement of thought, plus emotions. And you become an entity. It's this mental emotional entity, which we call, by the way, ego. It's the ego. The ego is the unconscious part of you, the unconscious being that pretends to be you. And you are actually, when this happens, you are like a sleepwalker or a dreamer. You are asleep. You're not really there. You're not there. So your inner space is being occupied by a mental, emotional energy form or entity. And this unobserved mind is the ego. And that is the state of human unconsciousness. So at this moment, before we go more deeply into that, right now, just acknowledge any emotional state that may still be in you. There it is. Okay, there it is. Let's say it's anxiety, or let's say it's a remnant or irritation from coming here. There it is. Okay, there it is. You are directing attention to it, and you just say,
Yeah, you can name it, but you don't have to. You just know it's there. There it is. Then something happened then. What happened is you're no longer totally in the grip of it. You have come in, you have awakened a little bit, and you can now observe your inner state on the level of emotion and on the level of thinking. You can thinking what has your mind been saying about any situation. Suddenly you know what your mind might be creating an unhappy narrative about a situation you find yourself in. Like even a simple thing, like you're lining up at the airport, and it's taking, these days some airports are not doing very well, and so there's a long lineup, or wherever it may be, and you're getting very irritated and angry, and you can, narratives arise in your mind, stories you tell yourself, God, how dreadful, it's just, why am I even doing this? Why can't they do, why don't they, why can't they, why didn't they? They should have. And of course they should, but they didn't. There are all kinds of shoulds that humans should have done, but they didn't do it. Humans are deficient in many ways, you might have noticed. Not you, others. It's so much easier to see the unconsciousness in others than to see it in yourself, obviously. Self-knowledge is most difficult knowledge. So narratives arise, and you don't know that the narratives arise because you become those thoughts. You are identified. And then the emotion reflects the thought. And many people these days, even on planes, they get very, you might have read about it, they get very angry. There have been lots of angry passengers on planes in the last 2 years. Maybe it's the mask that makes them angry, I don't know what it is, but they get very angry and some become really violent, very unconscious. They are being possessed by that. They don't know it. They are asleep. So something has taken possession of them, the ego. So just acknowledging your inner state, there it is, and something has happened. It's hard to express in words what that means. One could say there's now a little bit of space around the emotion. Here's the emotion, and then there's the awareness that comes in. There it is. You allow it to be. It's because it's part of the present moment. If you are not aligned with the present moment, you'll be unhappy and frustrated the rest of your life. But we'll probably go more into that later. Present moment, allow it to be. There's a space around the emotion. And then gradually your sense of self, your sense of who you are, your identity, this is key. That's already, one could say this is the key thought of our gathering. So if you're in a hurry, you can leave after this. It only takes 1 minute to explain. So the key thing is your identity, which is your sense of self, is no longer derived either from your thinking, the stories you tell yourself, the judgments, the interpretations, the labels, etc. Is not your identity is no longer derived from the movement of thought, nor is it derived from the emotional field inside you, because until this happens, your identity is the emotional mental entity. It gives you your identity. That is the egoic identity. The moment awareness comes in,
a slight shift happens. You have stepped back from the movement of thought, and you have stepped back from the emotional field, so to speak, and you've become aware. There is now this awareness, I sometimes call it presence, you can use other words. This awareness is a higher or deeper, whatever word you want to use, a higher, deeper level of dimension of consciousness that has arisen in you. That is spiritual awakening. And then, and this is only the beginning, the first arising of it. But you already begin then to see that who you essentially are is not what happens in your emotional field, is not the thoughts that go through your mind, but who you essentially are is the awareness behind it all. It's a still, alert, silent, still space of presence. And that's an amazing realization that there is a deeper, one could also say higher, identity in you than the egoic identity that's mental, emotional. This doesn't mean you deny that dimension. That dimension is there. But you have discovered something deeper or higher. I prefer deeper because it's kind of deep within. You have discovered something deeper, and that is that gradually, first it's perhaps a few glimpses you have occasionally, but gradually that deepens, the presence or the awareness in you deepens, and the thinking and the emotion still happens, but no longer supplies you with your sense of self.